everybody. We are very excited to have you here for this Monday Lunch and Learn. As you know, our focus today is on higher education updates, and we are very excited to have Linda Braddy, Interim Provost at Dallas County Community College District and President of Brookhaven College. She's going to be sharing information about things that are happening at the state level through the Texas Association of Community Colleges, things that are happening at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and also things that are happening at our respective institutions. I know that most of us have had our heads down doing our own specific job, and so it's really good when we get the opportunity to sit back and learn a little bit about all of the things that are happening around the state. I want to ask you to do a couple of things as we get started. The first is we're going to have everyone on mute. Please keep yourself muted so we don't wind up with background noise. And I would also like for you to use the chat as a way to ask questions, and I will relay those questions to our presenter as we go along. Finally, one thing that helps, especially when I'm trying to relay questions, is if you will go in and rename yourself. You'll see that some of us are in using our name or our institution, but others may have a default that's, letters and numbers. The way that you can rename yourself is you just click on your own image or icon, choose more, and then it'll have a rename option. When you click on rename, then you can put in your name. I would really love it if you put in at least your first name and last initial, or you could give your entire name. You'll notice it gives you an option to remember that for future meetings, or you can just do it for this one. But if you will do that, that will help me to recognize you as we go. All right, with that, I am going to hand it over to Linda, and we'll get started.
Well, thank you, Christine. I'm happy to be with you all today. I do see a lot of familiar names, so I know there's a lot of folks from my district on. So what I'm going to do is share with you kind of a big picture of what's been going on with the Texas Association for Community Colleges since COVID shut things down. And so this report is really going to hinge on the information I've gotten from those meetings. So they have, normally they have a CEO meeting, I think once a month, and then the CAOs also meet. But recently, at spring break, the CEO group started meeting 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And so the meeting was scheduled for an hour, and it was a very, some of it was to have senators, to have Congress people come and speak like they normally would at the CEO meetings, but also there was a lot of logistical sorts of discussions. So for instance, early on, we established a group to look at returning to campus. And so Millicent Valek chaired that group and just looked at details about returning to campus and bringing students back, for CTE experiences or whatever that might be. And then Brent Wallace headed up a group on athletics and, how we were going to deal with that. And so they worked and kind of made some reports to the group. And so then I guess we were about 4 or 5 weeks into it. They cut the calls down to twice a week, and now they've cut the calls down to once a week, but they're still meeting much more frequently than they used to. So as I was going back through all of the notes and things that have been discussed, I realized the discussions early on are kind of moot now, because they had to do with, some of the early issues that we were dealing with. And like some of the community colleges, in Texas have housing. And so there were issues about they still had students on campus in the campus housing and that kind of thing. So anyway, I decided to focus more on the recent things that are still sort of maybe not completely resolved or in limbo, and then kind of what some of the future plans are. And I'm happy for you all to ask me any question along the way that you like. I'll share with you what I know. So Ray Martinez and other folks from the coordinating board have been on these calls. I think every meeting that we've had, they've been involved. And so I wanted to share some information that he has shared with us, he made a point over and over again to say that the intent of the coordinating board through this time is to be a resource. They asked over and over again what they could do to add value and to help us. And they definitely did not want to impose anything on the institutions of higher ed that would add burden to what we were doing. And so, for instance, one of the things that they've done is created an FAQ that they have on their website. I'm sure many of you have seen it, that makes recommendations. But one of the recent recommendations that they made about returning to campus was about health screenings. And so there was some discussion in this meeting about, well, do we have to take their temperature, that kind of thing. And basically Ray said, we're not going to decide that for you. We're going to say, in accordance with CDC guidelines, you should have some sort of health screening, but we're not going to tell you what you have to do. So then during the meeting, there would be some discussion among the presidents about, you know, what are you all going to do? And of course, at DCCCC, we have an app that people self-report through the app before they can come back to campus and that kind of thing. And so, but then some institutions were actually going to check people's temperature before they allowed them to come on campus or whatever. So, so throughout this time, Commissioner Harrison Keller has been in frequent conversations with the governor's strike force and staff, you know, the COVID strike force and that kind of thing. And the coordinating board continues to update these FAQs. And just recently, I think May 19th, so about the middle of the month, CDC released some higher education guidelines. So the coordinating board was updating their FAQs based on that. And so they have an FAQ for reopening, and it's up on their COVID-19 landing page. And they have a checklist and some recommended protocols. So I kind of mentioned one of those earlier about the health screenings. Then they also, this checklist that they have addresses summer 1 and summer 2. And they are recommending that summer stays online or primarily online. But labs and clinicals obviously can come back in person following CDC guidelines. So that's sort of how we've phrased it at DCCCC, is we're primarily online unless there's a specific reason why you have to have some face-to-face time with students on campus, like industry standards that we have to meet for students having some hands-on experiences. So, so the coordinating board also is using feedback from this TAC group, the Texas Association for Community Colleges, and then that will influence the fall recommendations from the coordinating board. So they're working on that. So as you know, we had a fair, the CARES Act, as you can imagine, generated a lot of conversation. There was a lot of, you know, sort of speculation in the beginning about what it was going to be, what was it going to be like what we'd be able to use the money for, if we'd be able to reimburse ourselves. So when it actually, when the guidance came out on it, it was much more restrictive than we had hoped. And again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. But then more recently, on the 21st of May, there was a new statement from the federal government that really sort of said that these guidelines or whatever kind of lack the force and effect of law. So it was kind of like, we're not really going to be enforcing anything, which made it more confusing. But basically, eligibility for Title IV is still a requirement. Students have to be qualified for Title IV funding in order to qualify for funding from the CARES Act. And then they shared some information about criteria for reporting purposes. So there's a lot more information about that out on the website that you can check out if you like. But basically, half of the money has to be used for direct student aid, emergency aid, or whatever. But then there were a lot of conversations about it can't be used to pay like tuition bills from the past and that kind of thing. So, and I'm happy to try to answer questions about that if you have any. The TAC group also established a dual credit work group early on in this, and It turned out that most of the CTE partnerships with our dual credit partners were able to go online and be completed. I think there were some school districts it recognized it was a little harder sometimes to do online with the high school students. Maybe they weren't quite as mature as maybe adult age students who are more accustomed to taking online classes. And so I know we had some issues with students struggling to be able to function well in the environment. So I know this group was focused on trying to provide some more support for that. And let's see, so it was just a few meetings back, so it was maybe 2 weeks ago, Representative Angie Chin Button, she was the last person that came and talked with this group. She represents District 112. She's on the Higher Ed Committee, and in the past she has served on Appropriations Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. She talked about that for Texas, for her district in particular, but for Texas broadly, we had the double impact of the pandemic as well as oil prices. So I don't know how aware you are of that, but oil prices really bottomed out, even to the point of maybe even being negative. So it means we're paying people to take that off our hands. And so that's devastating to the economy in Texas. And so she referenced uncertainty as emerging as the new enemy, because we just don't know. And I'm sure you have felt the fast moving changes, right? So today we're going to do this, and then tomorrow something changes and we're going to need to do something different, and the next day it changes again. And even sometimes it seems hour by hour due to, the county restrictions and the state restrictions on shelter in place and all that kind of stuff. So that's just been, continually changing. So I liked the way she characterized uncertainty as being our new enemy. And she said that the legislature does not really know what type of dollars will be available to Texas from the CARES Act and otherwise, or what type of strings will be attached to those dollars. So that's, again, uncertainty. We don't know what the financial gap will be that COVID-19 is going to leave. We do know that our state has one of the largest rainy day funds. There's an economic stabilization fund of $8.5 billion. So that's better than some states have, which is good for us. And I'm sure you probably heard that universities and other state agencies have been asked currently to reduce their budgets by 5%, but community colleges were exempt. So we were very happy about that. Because we're seen as essential. We have a lot of short-term training programs that can help reskill people for jobs, people who have lost their jobs or whatever. And so, and also related to health sciences programs. And we know that, we don't have enough healthcare workers. And so given our importance in those arenas, we were exempted. So we do feel like community colleges are positioned to be a very important part of the workforce solution after COVID-19. We're positioned so well because we already do more with less, and we operate in a very efficient way. So these were some of the things that that she was pointing out to us in her presentation. And so she shared that we have a footprint to provide access to higher education for individuals who maybe never considered going to college, also for dual credit students, and then for students who are looking for a more affordable route. And you all know that, the population of students that we serve. And so someone asked her about the bills that she planned to sponsor after COVID. And she talked about her main focus being to try to help all Texans put a roof over their head and food on their table. And so she felt like access to high-speed internet, affordable daycare, adequate health care, and strong public education were really key. And I really appreciated her talking about high-speed internet, because that's one of the things that we have talked about at DCCCD in particular, is that is a real source of inequity in our community. And so it limits access to education for communities that are disadvantaged when it comes to having high-speed internet. And so I think we're thinking what we might be able to partner with perhaps with DISD or whatever to remedy some of that. So basically, she talked quite a bit about connecting unemployment with retraining, people who are unemployed with retraining, and also how she wanted to help address housing issues due to COVID-19. She talked about there were a lot of issues already in housing, and now with people losing their jobs, it's likely that it could get worse, and it's a long-term problem that needs to be addressed. So she talked about other policy issues that she was considering or focused on were about adult learners, about data transparency, and then of course formula funding. That's always a hot topic, I think. And so she felt like there were key legislative offices that were also looking at some issues like base year funding. So this is our base year for the biennium. And this might be the year for some of those fixes, that things that have been issues that should be fixed. And so that's the gist of what she shared with us. And then some of the things that Ray Martinez has shared with us recently is they have a task force on reopening. And so I don't know if you all are familiar with SREB. It's the Southern Regional Education Board. And so there's a TAC member, Jeanette McCallan, who's a member of this task force that SREB has. And so she reported that Oklahoma, for instance, had decided not to come back after Thanksgiving. So I think there are several institutions in Oklahoma who had decided to do that. And UT also decided to do that. So they're starting a little earlier, and then they're not going to come back after Thanksgiving. And so the SREB, they're going to have on their website a playbook, is what they're calling it, to also offer advice. And they were discussing the issue of masks, for instance, and what to do if students refuse to wear masks, or if employees refuse to wear masks, and that kind of thing. So they're going to be addressing some of those issues in their playbook as well. And then I don't know how many of you have heard of the 300 by 300 initiative. So Dr. May brought this to TAC, and it was amazing how quickly people signed on to this, other institutions. So it's basically 300,000 in 300 days. So it's short-term credentials, sort of a thing that can be acquired in 300 days or less. And we're aiming across the state to grant 300,000 of those. And so it's a coalition of community colleges across the whole entire state, focused on short-term credentials, which are going to be even more important for economic recovery, as more and more people find that they need to reskill. And so, as you know, millions of people have filed for unemployment already. And so this was an effort to engage all 50 of our community colleges to get as many people qualified and back to work as possible. And I mentioned already about how we really are the drivers of economic recovery, we as community colleges. And so after the pandemic, even more people are going to be depending on us. So it was pretty remarkable, the consensus that the original document received, the draft that was shared with folks. So there were three key parts of that. It was a statewide vision. There was collaboration that included other agencies in higher ed, the Texas Workforce Commission and the Texas Education Agency, because we know that silos are not going to help with future training and economic recovery. And so the second aspect that was really important was data, and how we need to pay attention to the effectiveness of programs and data from workforce and higher ed. Also the gaps in data that we have right now that's not being collected. For instance, we're not collecting, generally speaking, we're not collecting data outside of like Pell Grants. And so what about other data that we might be that we might need? So again, the goal was to create a statewide network of community colleges to focus on these short-term training programs, and that is moving forward. I believe the presidents that are involved in that have called upon some of their marketing folks from their institutions to work together to really push that forward. So let's see, I think that's, one thing I wanted to share with you is that I think is really important. So you all probably are familiar with Russell Lowry Hart at Amarillo College. So he led a discussion a week ago at the TAC meeting that he was requesting a collective response from TAC to Minneapolis, to the George Floyd incident. And we had a really great discussion about how we could help change the narrative and what we could do at our institutions. And so we sort of talked about, at a minimum, we could find ways to infuse our law enforcement curriculum. A lot of us have, law enforcement academies, and that we could find ways to address institutionalized racism issues around that. And that we kind of discussed it really was not just a race issue, it's also a socioeconomic issue. And so, we talked about the importance of community colleges in helping people get an education so they can better themselves economically. And so that group met on Friday. I haven't heard a report out of that, but and another thing that we talked about was maybe having conversations with our history and government faculty about the history, the way history is being taught, and kind of, is there a well-balanced version of history that's being taught? And then also voter registration drives and things like that we might be able to do locally. So again, I haven't heard a report out on the actual, the conversation that the group had, but hopefully we'll be hearing something from them soon. And then the last thing that I have to share with you is the coordinating board has formed a transfer work group. And there are 4 of us from community colleges who are part of that. And then there are 4 administrators from universities across the state of Texas. And TAC is helping lead that. So Jacob Friday from TAC is one of the co-leads on that. And so we've spent the last couple of months hearing from other states on what they have done with transfer. And among all institutions, but we probably feel the pain the most from 2-year to 4-year institutions in Texas. And so we've heard from them what they've done, how they did it, how they worked to minimize credit hours lost when the student transfers between institutions. And so we have our first working meeting next week. And the goal is that by July that we would have something to send forward to the coordinating board, to the board, for them to consider. And so from what we've seen from these other states, we really have a lot stronger foundation in Texas to build on than what many of those other states had, because we already have ACGM and a common course numbering system, which none of them had that when they started. And then we also have the fields of study. And some of them had some versions of that, but a lot of them did not. And so we have a pretty strong foundation on which to build. And we sort of, we already know what a lot of the issues are. And so it's really just coming together and having those tough conversations. I feel like they could be tough conversations. But I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to make some real progress. And so we've kind of agreed among ourselves with the community college folks that we're not going to focus on AAS degrees. We're only going to focus on AA and AS, because we feel like that would just kind of muddy the water and maybe put up more roadblocks than it would help. And so we're also working toward ensuring that courses transfer in for degree credit, not just elective credit. And so those are some of the issues that we're hoping we can make some progress on. So, Christine, I'm happy to answer questions or call it good.
Okay, Linda, I do not have any questions in the chat box yet, but I do have some topics and questions based on the things that you have shared already. And then also just a couple topics that I had on a list for discussion.
Okay.
So one of the things that I know y'all have been working on, but I was hoping you might be able to give us a little bit of an update on is testing, and how the colleges are addressing testing, TSI testing, or for the universities, SAT, ACT, because I know there had been some challenges in that area. And so the extent to which that's being waived for this next semester or coming year, or if testing has been, created with some alternate modes. So.
Well, across the state, it was waived. The TSI requirement was waived for summer registration and fall registration. And so at DCCCD, we did put in a way to do this remotely, to do it electronically, but we're not requiring it of students. So we really are waiving that requirement. And I believe people across the state the feeling I get is most institutions are doing that. And then turning to multiple measures for placement. And so looking at, so what's the last course, the highest level course that a student took in English and math, right? If we're looking at placement in those two areas, and what were their grades and what was their overall high school GPA, and then having a conversation with even a recommendation from a counselor in high school, but then having a conversation with an advisor to talk about, where the student really feels like, because sometimes students will insist that they're ready for a higher level course. And I've seen some research that indicates that we underplace students traditionally anyway too much. And there's been some really strong research out of California, for one, where they were looking at multiple measures placement. And I know I've heard from faculty, and I will confess to having been very skeptical about a high school class rank and high school GPA, because there seems to be sometimes a fair amount of skepticism about grade inflation or whatever. But California is doing exactly that. And they have doubled how many students can go directly into like college level math and English and be successful. So clearly we are underplacing too many students. So I have encouraged our vice presidents and deans as much as possible to sort of, tend to overplace rather than underplace. So maybe, okay, well, it looks like you might be able to be successful in college algebra. Let's go ahead and put you in developmental or put you in co-rec just to be on the safe side. It's like, let's err on the side of pushing them up into the higher level class, and then, let them know they can get support or whatever. And so I'm not saying ridiculously overplace people, but when there's a little bit of a judgment call, we'll err on the side of overplacing. So anyway, I'm hoping we can get some really great data from this summer and fall when we weren't using TSI, and we can see how these multiple measures work for us, because there's some evidence that indicates that's a better way to place students anyway.
Right. Yeah, we've been working with the California Acceleration Project on the same things with our developmental education committee and forum. We did have a question that came up related to the TSI, and this specifically is, does the TSI waiver apply to dual credit courses as well?
Yes, it does. Yes, it was actually for a different reason. There was some other justification for so it didn't just across the board apply to all students, but there was a way to make it apply to dual credit if you count them some other way. And you'll have to forgive me for not remembering the detail of that, but yes, it does apply to them as well.
Okay. I have another question for you. And this impacts some of our colleges and universities and others not as much, but what are you hearing about collegiate sports and the extent to which there's been any information or anticipation about when or if that will happen for the next year, what that might look like, and then also dormitories and any of the guidance around that campus life, dormitory, and also, just those places where you're probably, especially if you have communal bathrooms, not going to be able to practice physical distancing.
Yeah, so I have not heard the TAC group talk much about housing for fall. I think that's part of what the coordinating board is working on now, is fall recommendations for fall. and having an FAQ. And so there has been some discussion about athletics among that group. And I know that athletic directors are already looking. So the NJCAA, for instance, has put out quite a bit of guidance, and they were looking to bring athletes back in August. I think there's still some uncertainty about that. And so I think, I think some of it probably hinges on if we start the students in August and then we have to go back on, like if there's a resurgence of COVID in the fall because of, you know, intermingling with the flu and all that kind of stuff. And if we have to pull some things back, is that going to cost another year of eligibility and that sort of thing? So that's definitely still an open question, but I do think that the athletic programs are looking to the NJCAA for some very strong guidance on that. And I know they had a call just about 2 weeks ago, and some of our presidents were on the call from DCCC. I wasn't able to attend it, but I know as a result, our athletic director has already put out kind of a plan for it and kind of put it forward for approval. So I haven't heard that any colleges have made final decisions yet, but the last I heard, they were looking at the possibility of August.
So this brings us back then to, you said you have a TAC group that's working on making recommendations for fall. And so you also mentioned that some institutions are shifting their calendar and not coming back after Thanksgiving. Are you seeing that that is something that TAC is likely to recommend? Are you seeing the community colleges plan to change their calendar at all?
I have not heard any discussion about community colleges in Texas shifting. The day that we did talk about that, and someone shared that Oklahoma and Oklahoma institutions were doing that, and that UT had decided to do that, there still was no, there were the institutions that were kind of weighing in the chat, the presidents that were weighing in the chat, they were not planning to do that. Now, knowing how things are going, that doesn't mean it'll stay that way. You know, it might shift at some point, but right now I've not heard of anybody in Texas, any community colleges that are planning to do that.
We had a question that came up in the chat, actually two. I'm going to address one right now because it's related to what you were just discussing. Some of the institutions, well, all the institutions have at least moved some of their courses back on campus, whether it's limited to those labs and clinicals, or in some cases, like I know Tyler Junior College is actually having full on-campus classes this summer. But the question is, have you heard from the individual colleges about ways they are addressing physical distancing and entering and exiting classrooms? That you could stagger exiting, it would be easier to manage, but how are you handling entering? And are there ideas that have been discussed?
Yeah, so I have not heard ideas discussed about entering and exiting. I've heard a little bit bigger picture ideas though about splitting students into two groups and having, you know, if you have a class of 20, splitting them into two groups and having half of them come one day and half come another day, if it's like a Tuesday, Thursday class or something. So there has been discussion about that. There's been a lot of discussion about face masks and taking temperatures and those kinds of logistics that actually those apply to employees and students. You know, the conversations that I've been part of. As far as the coming back to campus, what I do know, it's been interesting that even after spring break, there were still some colleges who continued to do some of the CTE hands-on stuff face-to-face. They would do other stuff virtually, but it was dependent. One of the things I noticed was it depended on which county you were in and how restrictive the county shelter-in-place orders were. So for instance, for us in Dallas, we were super, super strict and very locked down and we couldn't do anything. But Collin County was way less restrictive, right? And so it seemed that the big city areas, the urban areas were more restrictive. And then the farther you went away from the urban areas into the more rural areas, they were much more, they were much less restrictive. So some of those colleges, like I said, they had, you know, students were on campus in housing well beyond spring break. But if it had been in Dallas, I don't think we could have done that, given the orders that were in place. So, so that has really dictated, I think, some of the differences that you see among what the colleges have been able to do. So I know that the conversations I've heard, it seems the majority of colleges that I know of are still doing mostly online for summer and just bringing students to campus for the things that are really necessary. And so, like, again, there's industry standards that we have to meet. You can't do welding, or we haven't figured out a way to really do welding effectively, online in a virtual environment. They actually need to run the equipment and that kind of thing. So that's what we're working on right now is we have students who, because we didn't have anybody come to campus after spring break at any of the DCCCD colleges. And so we had some CTE programs that had to give incompletes. So we're starting this week to bring students back to campuses to complete those incompletes from the spring. A lot of them were able to go ahead and finish because they'd already done half of their, hands-on experiences face-to-face, up through spring break. So they were able to finish the rest of it online. And I know the coordinating board, you all are probably already familiar with this, but they had given us the option to do competency-based completions in the classes. And so I haven't heard discussions about that continuing, but I suspect it will, as long as there's a lot of colleges that are focusing on still remaining online as much as possible for the fall. So anyway, so I know that we're just now finishing up our incompletes from the spring, and we're using that experience that we're gaining to inform how we're going to do it in the summer and how we're going to do it in the fall as far as bringing students back. But I mean, it's a real, if you think about the burden on faculty that we're talking about, that if they have to split a class and do a lab twice, or 3 times, depending on how many students are in their class, that's double or triple work for them on those aspects. And so that does, that can really be a hardship. But we did also extend our hours. We sort of said, like, on these incompletes and on scheduling for the summer, you can go 6 a.m. to midnight or whatever you need to do to get them all in. And so we're sort of leaving it up to the programs to decide. Basically what we did was we went through our facilities, went through every room and said, okay, you can safely have 6 students in here at a time. You can safely have 9 students in here at a time, or whatever. And then we handed that information to the faculty, the program faculty, to figure out how they were going to manage to get all of those hands-on experiences done. And we're looking at technology that can help when an instructor's doing a demonstration, that it would be able to, get all of that and put it on a big screen so students don't have to crowd around. And so we're looking at those kinds of things for fall also.
Right. And that's what I'm hearing from other colleges as well, is, reducing caps for sections or dividing them, filling in what might have been slow time so you can spread your classes out, either having an hour between them to provide cleaning of the room in between, or in some cases, especially in the summer, only using a room once a day so that you have that opportunity. So yeah, all kinds of innovative things. And, anything that happens this summer, we know will help to inform what we can do in the fall and the spring. So I was wondering if that's being captured, if that knowledge, that's being acquired is actually coming back to TAC or someone else, so that we can all learn from it.
Yes, I think so. I think that return to campus group is still, thinking about those kinds of things. And I also think that the TAC staff members and also the coordinating board members that are on those calls are picking up on all of that. And that was something I was going to mention to Gabrielle. I'm sorry that I didn't have more information about the detail of the kind of going in and out of the rooms, but it would probably be worthwhile, if you haven't already, I would look at the coordinating board website and see maybe what they have there, because I don't know what level of detail they have there, but I know that they've put up as much information as they could. So I think they're also trying to capture some of the information that's being shared in those TAC meetings as well.
And so for everybody who's participating in this webinar, I will also put up the links to the CDC guidance for higher education, to the coordinating board FAQs, to the SRIB thing, their playbook, all of those kinds of things. And there was a question specifically about, are there any materials up yet about the 300 by 300? You said there's going to be some marketing, but is there information available now? And if so, I would put that link up.
No, there's not. I think the marketing will be the first information that's kind of publicly put out there for it. The rest of it has been, I think, internal draft documents that have been shared among the group that's working on that. I haven't seen. I've only heard reports out at TAC and from Dr. May at our meetings about it. So yeah, I think that's probably how the information will get shared.
So now I have a follow-up question. It actually came from our group, and is related to the transfer work group that you've been, TAC is helping lead that with the coordinating board. You had mentioned that, in learning from other states, that we were in a good place because we had the ACGM, we had the common course numbering, we also had fields of study. And the fields of study piece is what's prompted an additional question. There had been, beginning last fall, some indication that fields of study curriculum were not going to be continued. And I know that especially for our universities, before they went through a huge realignment of their programs to accept and apply those fields of study curriculum, they wanted more guidance on whether or not that is a way that, that the coordinating board and the state are going to go. So are you finding that that work group is promoting fields of study curriculum, or where are we on that?
So when we were given our charge by the Commissioner Keller, he sort of said something to, or, I won't say I'm quoting him, but what I heard him say was, if you all think we need to throw everything out and start all over, we can hear a recommendation for that or whatever. It's sort of like, no, nothing's off the table, that kind of thing. And so some of our initial conversations that we had were, well, we have a lot of great foundation already laid. We sort of have the pieces. We just need to figure out how to articulate all of these, right, and make them all work together. So I would say that we have not, there hasn't been any discussion of are we going to keep fields of study, or are we going to let them go? Because right now, the only thing we've done is had this initial discussion about our charge and kind of how we wanted to start the work, and we agreed we wanted to hear from other states. And so I said next week, this week, I lose track of what day it is. This week, we are meeting to do our first real working meeting and really have conversations about it. And so, so I feel like the community colleges would be interested in hearing what is the problem with the fields of study. We can fix it, right? Like what is the real issue, and let's work on fixing it. So again, I don't think anybody in the group didn't seem to be proposing we throw things out, but just sort of figure out how to make what we already have work well. And so maybe, we were talking about a split core. The universities were wanting a split core, last year, the year before, whenever it was. So it's sort of like, so, what do we need to do to make this work? Because we feel like we're coming into it with a posture of, well, I don't know. I probably shouldn't say that. I have a feeling it's sort of like, yeah, you all need to let us know what it is you feel like you need us to do that we're not doing. And we're open to those kind of conversations. So I think everybody's coming at it from the perspective of, we really want this to work because it's in the best interest of our students. And that's what we need to be thinking about, right? Is what's in their best interest, not our own personal institutions or whatever, right? It has to be collectively the state of Texas, the economic recovery. When we started this, we weren't in the COVID crisis, right? But now we are. And so it's really about the Texas, economy and the citizens of Texas and, our students specifically. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's fair to say that no one has proposed either one, that we have to keep the field of study and continue with that, or we need to get rid of the field of study and do something different. I think right now, everything is still on the table and we're just starting the conversations. So.
Well, and it seems like when you look at the coordinating board site right now that, all of the things that were happening in terms of looking at fields of study and programs of study, looking at implementation of SB 25. It's all kind of postponed, and it looks like this work group has kind of replaced it in some way, at least right now. Do you have a sense from the coordinating board about when they will start operating with the kind of governance and feedback that they've historically had in all of these sub work groups?
Well, I know that they want us to do our work really quickly. And so, July is when we're shooting for. In fact, I'd have to go back and look at my notes. I'm sorry, I didn't review those before I got on here, but I think we were looking to do some sort of first pass in June, maybe even with TAC or some group like that to get some feedback on here's what we're talking about doing. And then July, it would actually go to their board. So that's pretty fast for, for how we typically work in higher ed.
So it's really just taking the temperature and then giving that feedback so that at their board meeting, they can make those determinations.
Yeah, I mean, we're really going to make recommendations about, we're going to try to get something really laid out that this will work. We're recommending we do this, and we have, these institutions who are represented, as part of this group. We're all on board for it, kind of a thing. And so hopefully we can get consensus across the state.
Right.
Or at least in regional areas, if not across the entire state.
Well, and related to that, we did have some question that came up saying, that a lot of these kinds of things are tied into meeting, completion requirements and numbers for 60 by 30, but also for our institutions. And, is any of this setting up institutions to not be able to meet those requirements?
Oh gosh, I hope not. I would hope it would make it better, right? I mean, honestly, that's not intended to be just kind of a trite answer, but a rising tide lifts all ships. And so if we're talking about more students are completing because they're not losing so many hours when they transfer, that seemed to me to be a win-win for everybody. So I mean, again, maybe that's, I don't mean for that to sound flippant. I really mean that genuinely, that it seems it would be good for everybody, and the students, but the institutions too.
I think it's probably more related to the complexity right now inherent in things like reverse transfer, and those whole ideas about completion, and that hopefully in those discussions you'd mentioned data, and how transparent things are, that a big piece of transfer is being able to
yes.
Communicate better across our institutions, yes, and automate things where possible.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And that reminds me of some of the, one of the themes that has emerged from all of the conversations that we've had with people from other states, as well as Laurel Williamson, I think from Sanjak. She's part of this transfer work group, and she presented to the TAC CAO group last week about what Sanjak has done with the University of Houston. And from all of those presentations that we've heard, one of the really key things is getting faculty to talk to faculty from these different institutions. And so, I mean, there's even been conversations that they've shared that university faculty, and again, this is what I heard, but it was sort of like sometimes university faculty are surprised to find out that community college faculty have doctorates in their fields and that they do research and they, that kind of thing. And so, just that lack of knowledge and lack of understanding, that if you can just have those conversations at that level, that can really move things along, in a way that you wouldn't otherwise if you didn't have faculty talking to faculty. And so, so we've heard a lot of that being key to the success of these efforts. So, I mean, we've heard from a lot of states that was key to the efforts. So I'm sure we'll recommend that kind of stuff as the next step in the process.
So now I have a last group of questions that are kind of related to when we come back and have whatever our new normal is, that there really is an opportunity not to go back to the way things were with its gaps, with its inequity, with those entrenched things that we've always done, that we have the opportunity to make things better. And you had talked about that, and Russell Lowry Hart's emphasis of the fact that our higher education institutions need to have a collective response. need to, and this is something that we as a consortium are working on too, that we need to exemplify and promote anti-racism, right? And you talked about some changes in some of the curriculum, but my questions are related to some specific things. So we found that you mentioned the issue of high-speed internet, and that it became clear that there is inequity in access to high-speed internet. And it seems to be becoming something that is recognized at a state level as a public good, not a private good. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing that there might be the possibility of having, citywide networks like there are in some other states, that it would become a public resource rather than something that you have to individually buy, or that an individual educational institution would have to purchase? We also found this spring, especially with dual credit students, but it happened in other areas as well, that the technology didn't always work with the software that the colleges had. So specifically, if people had Chromebooks, they couldn't do some testing. There were, apps that didn't work. And so, are you coming up with some recommendations related specifically to technology and equity there? So anything you can share about that?
Okay. Well, so at the end, you were talking about the dual credit issues, and yeah, that dual credit work group is talking about those kinds of things. And we saw exactly what you're talking about, the Chromebooks. You couldn't do any lockdown browsers with those or whatever. And so I know our one of our biggest ISD partners is Dallas ISD, and I know they're looking at that on the laptops, the Chromebooks. Because like, for instance, in Alex, if you're using that for any math course, it has Respondus built in, and Respondus won't work on Chromebooks. And so, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about for even summer, but definitely for fall, is, are we going to be able to have, are we going to be able to have computer labs open for students to be able to schedule to come and use those computers for testing or whatever? And I know we have added some annotations to our sections in our browsable class schedule that says, if you're in this class, you're going to need this sort of device for the 4 exams that we take. Like, they're going to need to be able to borrow one from somebody or whatever. So that's not necessarily a solution in terms of we're going to provide something to them. But I think institutions far and wide who have never done this before are looking at having required, like, if you're going to be in this class, you have to have this textbook, right? Well, now the institution having some sort of a statement about, like, we're going to do this include ed where it's going to be electronic materials. So students are going to have readers of some sort, right? If not a laptop, then a reader. And so sort of having these minimum requirements for students. And if you require it, then financial aid can help, with that. So we're looking at that, and I know other institutions are talking about doing that as well. So that's kind of a local effort, is to make those things explicit of what you're going to need to be in this class, and kind of what you're going to need to be a student here, and that sort of thing. I know Dallas ISD is talking about paying for internet for their students in their homes for the coming, I guess, summer and fall. And they're also, I think they are looking at maybe switching from Chromebooks to something else, since they have not been very, they haven't always worked the way they needed them to. And so as far as the high-speed internet, I was thinking when the CARES Act money was coming in, I was like, so why can't we use that to put in some infrastructure in these communities, right? And use it to kind of equalize some of these inequities that we see. And so I know that we are talking to DISD about how we might partner to do something, because that is truly a societal thing. It's a, it should be that's available to everybody. It should be ubiquitous, and it shouldn't be an impediment to somebody getting an education. And I think it's going to get more and more and more important. I mean, used to, we had encyclopedias, and now you got to have the internet to be able to, write a research paper or whatever. And so on a kind of a bit, you were talking about how things were going to change rather than kind of going back to normal or whatever. You know, some of the things that are going to change are just for efficiency's sake, right? Like we had to convert everything to electronic processes. We had to get rid of some of the paper pushing, which is great, right? And so we don't have to go back to that now, right? Like we've converted to, you know, electronic versions of signing things. I mean, like I've been using Adobe Sign out the wazoo. I didn't even know you could do that. And it's great because you can click on there and it drops your actual signature into these documents, you know? And so anyway, I think there's going to be a lot of efficiencies we'll realize because of this, and also sustainability issues, right? Killing all the trees for all the paper that we were doing. So that's going to be good for everybody. I also think that for students, I think we're going to see a permanent shift to more virtual interacting with students in advising, and that kind of thing. You know, because what we're learning is we can advise them. Now, maybe we could do better in some cases if we were face to face with them, but probably the general population, we can do a lot of that virtually. You know, I mean, there are schools that are 100% online and they do it all the time. It's just a matter of us converting and doing that. So that could be more, you know, that could be an equity situation too. Somebody who's working and they can't come during regular business hours, or they have children and they got to wait till their kids go to bed, you know, well, then we could do this virtually for them. And so I think that's going to be a shift that we see that I hope that remains a permanent part, and that we continue to build that up, you know, and make that more robust as we move forward. So I think there are ways that we can serve our students better, and still provide support for them, though, face to face when they need it. Anyway, and I think that would also help us with if we could go more hybrid or keep some of our courses online, but really be effective, not just transitioning our lecture class that we did face to face and trying to put that exact thing online. It's like you have to do online learning differently, right? It's like when we switched from television to from radio to television. So we were doing radio shows, right? And when TV came along, we tried to just plop the radio shows onto TV, and it didn't work because it was a different medium. So they had to change how they were doing it. So it's the same thing going from face-to-face classes in person to online classes. And so we need professional development for faculty, I think, to help them. You know, we're doing that with a company we've contracted with at DCCCC to get faculty professional development to really focus on the quality of the online learning. So, you know, we can use the same amount of facilities if we even went to a hybrid version, and kind of stayed hybrid with some of our stuff. We'd have more room for more classes in the same facilities, and be able to serve more students. Anyway, so I think there are some positive things.
Absolutely. And so that actually is connected to a question that we had. I've got two questions left. So this is one. As things continue to be virtual in many workplaces, not knowing how the virus will peak at times, are there any adjustments to current curriculum to train people how to work virtually, which is different than doing school virtually? And as new virtual types of jobs are being created, are there new courses in development for that workforce, for people adapting their job focus?
Yeah, so I don't know about courses that are being developed, but there's definitely professional development that's already developed for employees for working. I mean, like some of the very early on things that we learned just from Dr. May talking to us was, okay, when we get on these meetings, we need to ask people to turn their cameras on, because then we don't feel so isolated. We can actually see people's faces and see body language and be able to feel like we're interacting with them. And that will help people who might otherwise feel isolated to be, you know, to feel more connected to people. And we also changed our meeting schedule. Instead of once a month, now it's once a week or whatever, right? And so I feel like that's learning how to work virtually, right? For supervisors, right? And kind of how we're doing things. So I think that our, you know, HR offices at different institutions are working on those kinds of things to try to help employees learn better how to work virtually. I think that as far as, and I know we're talking about working, but even in classrooms, like we're working on offering faculty like a a number one assignment, like assignment 0 or assignment number 1, to students to kind of help them get a little more accustomed to doing kind of the online environment and what it's going to be like. And that would be available to all faculty, you know, to use at the very beginning. So I do think there's some learning that we all have to do to get accustomed to this virtual environment and to be more productive in it, or to be equally productive in it.
Okay, well, we have reached 1 o'clock. The only one that we didn't get to is there any discussion related to the state, having a state common core for use by all institutions? It was a previous concern at the state level. And so the question is, are you seeing that as something that might happen? And we'll do a quick yes or no.
No.
Okay. All right. That's what we needed. Okay. So I wanted to mention that we on the consortium site do have a graphic and resources for how to work from home with guidelines. And so that might be something that would help the person who had the question, because that can be used with students. And I do think that any of the programs, especially our workforce ones and a capstone, might want to include a module that's specifically about working virtually, you know, because it is a part of the new workforce. With that, thank you everyone for joining us today. Next Monday, we'll be focusing on taking college teaching seriously. So this will be a specific faculty innovation related one. And then coming up on June 29th, we have a Monday Lunch and Learn that's focused on how colleges can exemplify and promote anti-racism. So I hope you'll join us for all of those. But until then, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.